Hello everyone. In this video lecture, we're going to be talking about symbolism, the way in which we employ symbolism in our creative writing assignments. First, we're going to look at cultural codes and connotations. In other words, connotations are just things that we think of or things that are associated with the words, the images, and the ideas that we present inside of our stories or that we hear and see in everyday life. We'll go through a definition of symbolism. We'll talk about the function of symbolism in stories. We'll look at the short story that I had assigned for you to read today, The Spider's Thread by Rynosuke Akutagawa, and we'll look at how this author employs symbolism. Then we'll go over some techniques, some approaches to developing symbolism inside your own stories, building on the techniques that we identify in The Spider's Thread. Lastly, I have a note on journal and workshop assignments. These are things that I have already said in relation to the two components, or these two components of our course, but I'll reiterate them here in video format at the end of this lecture. The first thing that I'd like you to do is to consider these three images: a mansion, a little baby lamb, and an anchor. What words, feelings, or concepts do you associate with each of these images? Pause the video, think about that for a minute, and then when you're done, come back and we'll discuss this and I'll start tying it into the subject of symbolism. All right. So some of the things that you might have associated with a mansion would be opulence, wealth, excessive wealth, perhaps. You might have a series of negative connotations or negative feelings connected to this mansion. With a lamb, you might have immediately thought of something that was adorable or, honestly, something that's quite delicious. Either way, thinking about this lamb, you might also think about religious connotations. I know that some of you have done some research into particularly Christian or Catholic religious concepts in order to apply them in your stories. And you may, in that investigation, have uncovered the fact that the lamb is a powerful symbol within Christian discourse. We are, at this moment, going through the Jewish Passover. The Passover lamb was slain, its blood put over the door frames of the Hebrew people in the original Passover during the 10 plagues of Egypt as they were going through the Exodus or just about to embark upon the Exodus. So it becomes this symbol, the shed blood of the lamb, covering over and protecting the people of Israel. That's a gross oversimplification of the biblical or Hebraic context. But in the Christian context, the lamb becomes a symbol for Christ, the perfect Passover sacrifice, the culmination of that sacrifice in the Christian conception of their religious schema. So the lamb has associations with innocence and with Christ. Christ is the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. And the anchor, something heavy or weighty. So if you referred to somebody as an anchor in your life, that could be either positive or negative. It certainly sounds negative in the sense that it's something weighing you down or holding you back, but an anchor provides you with safety, comfort, security. It holds you firm in the storms. What we've just gone over here are connotations, the things that we think about or the associations that we make when we look at a particular image. Connotation is fundamentally the basis for symbolism. Context helps us to determine what a symbol means. So one thing to keep in mind as we begin to consider symbolism is this: the prevailing sentiments and cultural presumptions that surround an object create connotations that inform our interpretation of a symbol. If you were unaware of this Christian context pertaining to the lamb, you would have a fundamentally different response to the image of the lamb. It's just a cute little animal. If you are Jewish and you're going through the Passover now, you understand the sort of historical, cultural, religious resonance of the lamb in your own tradition. Depending on where you grew up, what you learned, what your beliefs are, the symbol takes on, or the object, the image takes on different connotations. Now, symbols themselves are fairly easily recognizable. We encounter them in our everyday lives, and we don't even think about the fact that we're engaging in a symbolic analysis of their meaning. When we look at these three images, immediately you think of, well, corporatism, greed, right? Very low caliber food with that symbol of McDonald's. But there's an entire cultural weight, a series of beliefs and understandings that that symbol evokes inside of you just when you see the golden arches. Maybe it's a symbol of American cultural imperialism as they are sort of propagating across the world. You see McDonald's all over the globe. The rose, a classic symbol of love, and it has different color connotations as well. Different roses, whether they be pink or red or white, have different meanings in the language of floral symbolism. And the wedding band, a symbol of eternal devotion, of connection, a mark that signifies the relationship between two people. We use symbolism and we recognize symbolism without even thinking about it in our everyday lives. Now that we have this background information or this background understanding, we can begin to discuss the formal definition of symbolism and explore its applications. What I'd like you to do is pause the video and take a look at the brief clip from Batman Begins that I have posted in the description to this video. Watch that video about Bruce Wayne returning from his training, coming back to Gotham City, meeting up with Alfred, his butler, and returning on a plane, his private jet, to the city of Gotham, wherein he discusses the process of transformation by which he will become something more than a man. All right. That video clip deals with explicitly an exploration of symbol. And in fact, the entire Batman trilogy is an extended, or the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy, is an extended analysis of society's relationship with religious symbology. It's impregnated with innumerable different kinds of Christ's mythologies and illusions, some of them of varying caliber and success, but it advances a coherent symbolic analysis. That's beside the point, unless you want to watch those films, and you haven't, because you really should. They're phenomenal. Regardless, Bruce Wayne identifies and defines for us the nature of a symbol. Things that we can take away from Batman or Bruce Wayne's claim that he has to become something more than a man. If he can be something incorruptible, something primal, if he can be a symbol, then he can never be destroyed. Even if the man dies, the symbol can endure. A symbol, in its most basic definition, is exactly what Bruce Wayne describes. It is an object that represents something else. In this case, Batman represents a kind of hope, a vision for Gotham and its salvation, the possibility of the people rising up and throwing off the shackles of their criminal oppressors and the corruption that has infiltrated the entire infrastructure of their civilization. Batman is a man, but he's more than a man. He's a symbol for everything that Gotham aspires to achieve, their hopes and their dreams. Objects represent or stand in for a concept or a reality. Now, symbolism is inherently personal and subjective. Just as your understanding of the cultural associations with the lamb inform your responses to it and your understanding of what the lamb means, so too do characters and observers or readers of a story have a personalized response to the symbols therein and the objects therein. Think about that Batman Begins example again. Bruce Wayne as Batman, as the symbol of Batman, inspires and represents hope for the populace. But the criminals who look up into the night sky and see the blazing bat signal projected on the clouds do not associate him with hope, they associate him with fear. So the meaning of a symbol shifts or morphs. It becomes somewhat amorphous depending on the particular context in which you find it and the subjective personal responses of the individual and their background, whether it be sociological or cultural. And thus, cultural and historical factors influence the interpretation of that symbol. For instance, a color. For us, yellow represents something perhaps sickly or diseased. So when we see something with the color yellow, we might associate it with illness. However, in another culture, that color might have a completely different symbolic resonance. Other cultures might view that color yellow as representative of royalty, as we do with purple. What we have to do when we look at a story is consider contextual clues. What is the material that surrounds the symbol telling us about the meaning of the symbol and the function of the symbol through the rest of the story? And this also applies to characters and their reactions. When we look at the people of Gotham being inspired to action by the blazing bat symbol that has been cast upon a building in The Dark Knight Rises. Again, Christ metaphor. The Dark Knight Rises. They're inspired to hope. They're inspired to positive action. When the criminals see it, they cower in terror and say, you know what, tonight, I'm just not feeling it. I'm not feeling like committing any crimes tonight. Because the symbol to them represents the fear of justice and reprisal. Now, some of the purposes of symbolism. Symbolism can add complexity to the argument or themes of work. Rather than presenting your theme in a facile or simplistic fashion, you can develop it more subtly and even more precisely at the same time by using a symbolic presentation of ideas. Symbols can also convey ideas more concisely and effectively. Rather than going on to an extensive excursus on the nature of your argument, you can provide a symbol and color it or present it in such a way as to convey that argument regarding whatever topic you're addressing concisely. It is also a means, or symbolism is also a means of engaging your reader in the process of deriving meaning from your story. Rather than asserting the meaning of your text directly, you are inviting your reader into this participatory activity whereby their contribution is necessary for the derivation of meaning. They have a pleasure of grappling with the text in a way that is not afforded to them if you simply tell them your ideas outright or present them directly without the subtle intermediary layer of symbolism. And likewise, if your story has a certain emotional resonance. If you want to present an emotion or to inspire an emotion in your readers, you can borrow from the weight of connotations that are already associated with those images or with those objects that you are using as symbols. I'll give you an example. From Ernest Hemingway's seminal work, The Old Man and the Sea. Santiago, the principal character, the old man, who has been a tremendously successful fisherman throughout his entire life, is a paragon of the kind of resilient, robust masculinity that Hemingway admired and extolled, has become old. He's lost his ability to actually perform all the wondrous activities that he did when he was younger. At this time, when his strength has waned, he now has only his experience, his cunning, and his wit to tackle the greatest challenge of his life, the great marlin with which he battles alone on the waters for days on end. Santiago, at numerous points through this struggle, is associated with Christ by way of a series of references and allusions. For instance, he holds the fishing line over his shoulders, battling with the marlin. And as the line goes taut, it digs into his shoulders, pressing in upon him. And he groans as the line cuts into his hands, as one might when his hands were being pierced by nails. So there are these explicit references to, for instance, the crucifixion of Jesus. Hemingway is trying to draw on these cultural associations and the emotions that he envisions his audience might have relative to the Christ narrative. And he impregnates his story with these associations and the connected feelings. What I'd like you to do now is to try to apply some of the processes and the approaches of symbolic interpretation to the story that you had to read for today, The Spider's Thread. I say here that important objects whose presence in a story are highlighted through repeated references or by inclusion in the title are oftentimes symbols. So one of the ways that you can identify a symbol is finding an object, or is by finding an object inside the story that is mentioned several times and that is highlighted as being important, either through inclusion in the title or by characters' relationship and reactions to it. Clearly, then, we're dealing with a symbol of the spider's thread in this story. So my questions to you would be these. What does the symbol of the spider's thread represent or symbolize? I want you to think about what you have to look at in order to identify that. How do you go about actually interpreting that symbol? What did you look at, consider, interpret, examine, or use generally to determine the meaning of the symbol? What techniques does Akutagawa employ to allow us to piece together the meaning of the symbol? Create a list. So we're going at this from two different angles. One, through the interpretive lens of how do we actually engage with the symbol, and on the other hand, we're looking at this from Akutagawa's perspective. What is he doing as an author in order to frame the symbol or to try to influence the way in which we will interpret the symbol to convey his intended meaning? Only after you've answered these questions should you move on to the next part of the video. However, I'd like to highlight a few key passages. If you're struggling with this, continue watching the video. I'll highlight a few key passages for you, and then you can use those to try to interpret the symbol. If you want, tackle the activity on your own, and then come back and watch the rest of the video. If you need help, continue on for another minute. We'll take a look at key highlighted passages. So, in terms of key passages, the ones that I've highlighted here might be elements of the narrative that you wish to consider in order to interpret the symbol. All right. I'm going to answer that second question first. I'm going to highlight the ways in which we can approach symbolism so that it will give us a window into how we can go back and answer question 1. As we go over these techniques to create symbols or to use symbolism in your story, remember that you're trying to strike a balance. You don't want to make your symbol too obvious by making these techniques or employing these techniques in a bald-faced way. You want to give the reader of your story the pleasure of discovery and revelation, the pleasure of actually grappling with the text and wresting meaning from it. Things to think about when you are creating symbols or interpreting symbols. Fine details, connotations, and word choice. If you know that an object is a symbol, look at the words that are surrounding it, the feelings that those words create, the associations that they have. What are those associations doing relative to the symbol? How is the symbol and what the symbol represents being framed by those word choices? Traditional associations. So the lamb, the apple, the snake, the anchor, the red dress, the heart, the rose. All of these are traditional symbols. Drawing on your background cultural knowledge, can you see how the author might be using this symbol in context? Look at the ways in which characters treat the object. How do they feel about it? What do they think about it? What do they do with it? For instance, if your character is a middle-aged man who has a pocket watch that he received from his father. The father is now deceased. Perhaps the pocket watch represents the relationship that he has with his father. If the watch is stopped, perhaps the watch represents, through its failure to function properly, the way in which his father has died. Or perhaps this character, we learn, has a negative relationship with his father, and the watch is broken. The watch could symbolize the relationship between his father and this young man or this middle-aged man. So always look at characters, how they think about the object, what the relationship to the object is, and how that relationship might change over the course of the narrative. And then turn to the narrative itself. What happens to the object over the course of the story? With these ideas in mind, we can interpret those highlighted passages of the spider's thread in order to identify its meaning. On the one hand, the facile interpretation here is, or the facile method of interpretation, is looking at Kandata and his views of the spider thread itself. Kandata views the spider thread as his only chance, his only hope of escaping hell. That could be the feeling or sentiment that the spider thread represents, hope. What then is the story saying about hope through the use of the symbol of the spider's thread? Well, if I look at the spider's thread as an object, I think about a spider thread as being slender and fragile, delicate. A mere puff of air can cause it to break apart. Now, let's look at how it's actually described in the story, building off of these associations and our understandings. Lord Buddha in heaven turned to see a heavenly spider spinning a beautiful silver thread atop a lotus leaf the color of shimmering jade. Gently lifting the spider thread, he lowered it straight down through the pearl-like blossoms to the depths far below. There are innumerable positive connotations associated with the words here. When I think of silver, I conceive of something that is rare and precious, incorruptible and beautiful. So if the spider thread, as we know from our analysis of Kandata's reaction to it and the role of the spider thread in the plot, represents hope, then perhaps the story itself is, through the connotations of the words connected to the spider thread, indicating to us that, that hope itself is marvelous, precious, the most beautiful thing in the world. Moving on, continuing to build this symbolic interpretation of the object as we go through further examples as the story evolves and goes forward. Yes, indeed, raising his head, Kandata chanced to look up towards the sky above the pond of blood, and saw the gleaming silver spider thread, so slender and delicate, slipping stealthily down through the silent darkness from the high, high heavens, coming straight for him. Notice here that the spider thread is slender and delicate. It's still beautiful, but it seems fragile. So maybe in turn, hope itself is fragile. So hope is precious but easily lost. Also look at the context, the surrounding context of the setting and characters' responses. It's gleaming in the darkness. Hope is most precious, or it appears most precious, in the darkest of times. Looking at the language used, the images projected to us, and characters' responses surrounding the object and its description in the story can give us a window into its meaning. And it can also be used by you as you're composing your stories to illustrate or to indicate the meaning of that symbol. And lastly, in the sort of climactic moment of the story when Kandata reveals his selfish heart and is again condemned to hell. And in fact, he's condemned to a far worse hell because now he will forever be able to look up at the spider's thread and he will have this eternal reminder of his chance at escaping. Kandata screamed at them, "Listen to me, you sinners, this spider thread is mine. Who said you could climb it? Get off, get off." At that very instant, the spider thread, which until then had been perfectly fine, broke with a snap. So the obvious symbolic interpretation would be that Kandata's hope has been destroyed, along with the object itself. As he falls, he looks up, and behind him all that remained was the dangling short end of the spider thread from paradise, delicately gleaming in the moonless, starless sky. So, just as Kandata now is going to suffer worse than he ever did before because he can see the remnants of the hope that he once had, and he will forever be reminded of the chance that he squandered. So too, the story might be saying, offering hope to someone can, at times, be the cruelest possible thing that you can do. Now, you might have your own interpretations of the symbol and the thematic argument that Akutagawa is making through the symbol itself, the symbol of the spider thread. But the process that we've undertaken here in order to analyze the symbol using those 4 key criteria is one that you should keep in mind as you go forward. So as a brief review of what we've discussed, those 4 things you should keep in mind as you're trying to construct symbols. Think about your word choice, significant details, connotations. Think about traditional associations, what you think of when you see an object or when you hear about an object. The ways in which characters treat the object and how their treatment of it and their responses to it evolve over the course of the story, and events in the plot related to the object. Those are your tools, the tools that you can use to illustrate the symbolic meaning of the objects inside your stories. The last thing I'd like to talk about very briefly does not pertain to symbolism. It's about the journal and workshop assignments in the course. These are things I've already suggested or I've already indicated to you in announcements and other documents, but just for your convenience, I'd like to go over them again. First of all, journals are posted in the class forum. So after next week, you'll be posting your journal entries. You should create a new topic with a title that has both your name and the date of the week. So for instance, April 21st. In that forum post, you will post all of your entry or entries for that week. So each week you'll create a new topic. Now, you don't have to have the full 4 pages. This is going to be a little bit less formal than the journal entries that you're submitting in person, the hard copies. Submit what you can. Next, you'll also have workshops. So the elements of the course that are replacing the workshop grades are responses to your fellow students' journal entries. You'll reply to that forum post. So for instance, if I had created Matthew Van Journal for April 21st, and then I had presented my journal entries in the first post, maybe Shira and Wade would respond to that and offer me some feedback. They would say, well, I enjoyed this element of the story. I was curious as to what you were trying to do here, and maybe you could refine this element of the story in this way. I don't know if that really fits what you were trying to do, but that's what I thought when I started to read it. Right? You're offering constructive commentary and feedback on their work. Again, Everything about your response should be conveyed in that attitude of respect that we've been discussing throughout this course. It's constructive criticism, it's respectful criticism, or respectful commentary. Not everything you say has to be positive. You might point out things that you thought could have been improved, or that you subjectively, personally didn't like, or that maybe didn't quite fit for you. But again, even those critiques have to be couched in positive, uplifting, affirming, and respectful language.